and welcome to the debate. I'm Marzieh Hashmi. Thanks so much for being with us. Well, the official version about some ghosts, Osama bin Laden in some cave on the other side of the world defeating our entire military establishment on U.S. soil is absolutely preposterous. Now, these are the words of Philip Marshall, who was a former American pilot and a writer about 9/11, who wrote about the hidden hands in the American government, who he said was behind the Twin Towers attack. And now the question is asked, are there hidden government hands behind Marshall's death, as he and his two children have been found dead on February the 6th, 2013.
Relatives and friends stunned by a violent...
An American news channel reporting a deadly shooting in the U.S. state of California. The incident has left 3 people dead. A man, so the story goes, first kills his 2 children, a teenage boy and a teenage girl, as well as the family dog, and then turns the gun on himself. But the shooting is not similar to the sort of gun violence taking place in the U.S. on an almost daily basis. The man has been identified as Philip Marshall, a 54-year-old former airliner pilot who authored 2 books on the 9/11 attacks, which he declared was an inside job. This fact has given the crime story a political hue, and it's raised serious doubts as to the cause of the deaths.
The police, the local sheriff's department, quickly concluded that Phil Marshall shot his 2 children, his dog, and then himself. However, the investigation had not been fully completed when they made that determination, and then the sheriff allowed the crime scene to be cleaned by professional cleaning personnel. So there has been a real problem in lost evidence, lost clues, and the right now there's a demand for either the Attorney General of the state of California, Kamala Harris, to launch her own investigation of Marshall's death, or the U.S. Attorney General, Eric Holder, ordering the FBI in to conduct an independent investigation. That is the only thing that can be done now, although critical evidence has been lost, unfortunately.
In his books, the veteran aviation pilot accused the administration of former U.S. President George W. Bush of orchestrating the 9/11 attacks. Marshall said,
"The true reason the attack was successful is because of an inside military stand-down and a coordinated training operation that prepared the hijackers to fly heavy commercial airliners. We have dozens of FBI documents to prove that this flight training was conducted in California, Florida and Arizona in the 18 months leading up to the attack."
Philip Marshall wrote in a statement last year,
"Think about this. The official version about some ghost in some cave on the other side of the world defeating our entire military establishment on U.S. soil is absolutely preposterous."
Marshall's death is not the only suspicious death with regards to the September 11 attacks. Many more people, including witnesses to the incident, have lost their lives in recent years. The cause of many of the deaths has been declared to be suicide. The official inquiry into 9/11 blamed several members of Al-Qaeda. Armed with box cutters, they'd allegedly hijacked passenger planes and flown them into the New York Twin Towers, killing thousands of people. But many Americans have still not accepted that story. The U.S. unleashed a devastating war on Afghanistan in the wake of 9/11. The stated aim, dismantling Al-Qaeda and killing or capturing its then leader Osama bin Laden. Many believe the war on Afghanistan was a front for invading Iraq, a country which sits on the 2nd largest oil reserves in the whole world.
Well, I'd like to welcome both my guests to the program. Out of Wisconsin, a member of the scientific panel for the investigation of 9/11, Mr. Kevin Barrett. And out of Berkeley, California, investigative journalist, Mr. Lee Kaplan. Thank you both for being with us right here on the debate. Well, let me start this off in Wisconsin with Mr. Barrett. Well, let's start from the beginning. Do you think that Marshall was murdered?
Well, when I heard about this, I was actually attending the Hollywoodism conference in Tehran, and it did sound very suspicious. Philip Marshall had written a book called The Big Bamboozle, which outlines a lot of interesting information about 9/11. I don't necessarily agree with all of his conclusions about the details of 9/11, but he certainly was casting severe doubt on certain aspects of the official story, and that did make his book somewhat dangerous. But I think more importantly, he had said to his friends and associates before he was killed that he was sitting on a bombshell, some kind of information that was going to change everything, and he was going to be publishing this in his next book. And so that may have been a mistake to talk about that. When I heard about it, I was very suspicious and did a little investigating and heard that there were some discrepancies. But it wasn't until I interviewed former National Security Agency officer Wayne Madsen, who is currently, I call him the thinking man's Seymour Hersh. That is our leading investigative journalist for leaks from the national security community. And when Wayne told me about his week-long investigation, during which he flew out from the East Coast, spent a whole week at the crime scene, investigating, talking to neighbors, he discovered that there were all kinds of obvious indications that this had been a professional killing, not a murder-suicide. And those include the fact that Philip Marshall, we now know, he was shot in the left temple, and yet he was right-handed. The police said that his house was far from neighbors' houses, so none of the neighbors would have heard any gunshots. In fact, the neighbors' houses are right on top of his house, virtually, and none of the neighbors heard gunshots. There was a door that was left wide open, a door that Philip Marshall never used, and was found wide open after his death. And there are a number of other indications, including the cleanup of the crime scene, an illegal and unauthorized cleanup of the crime scene by an SUV with state of California plates bristling with communications antenna from the top. So when we put all of this together, I think it's pretty obvious that using Occam's razor, the simplest explanation here is that this was some kind of black operations hit to prevent Philip Marshall from making public some kind of explosive information. Okay,
what about that, Mr. Kaplan? Do you find his death suspicious at all?
No, I don't. If we're going to use Occam's razor as a frame for this event, the Calaveras County Sheriff did investigate this. They're professionals, and they determined that the man killed his children and the dog and committed suicide, and this was due to the fact that he was estranged from his wife, who was away in Turkey. There were apparently text mails that his daughter had sent to friends, in which she was so frustrated with her father that she had wished that the family cat's claws could be shoved into his face. The fact is that he was distraught over the fact his wife was leaving him. He had actually filed a burglary complaint against his wife for going into the family home in 2008. She subsequently had to file charges against him for assault at one point. And the man knew that his marriage was ending. He didn't want to give up custody of the children, and he committed suicide. Well, Mr. Kaplan, why do you think that
why do you think that the crime scene itself was
ridiculous?
Was cleaned up so rapidly?
Well, well, let me give you something to say about Mr. Jarrett. Mr. Barrett. Mr. Barrett is a conspiracy theorist. He writes for Veterans Today. We're on Iranian TV here. The Velati Faqih regime.
That's the biggest veterans publication in America.
Now you're interrupting me. I'm trying to talk here. You'll have your turn. The point I'm trying to make here is the Velati Faqih regime, if they can tie anything against the U.S. government with the dispute over atomic weapons, if they can tie anything against the Saudis, who I'm no fan of the Saudis.
Well, I'm just asking your opinion, Mr. Kaplan, as an investigative journalist. I'm just asking your opinion. Why would the crime scene be cleaned up so rapidly when the investigation was not complete?
We don't know that the crime scene was cleaned up so rapidly. From what I've read from the Calaveras County Sheriff, they did an investigation. They described the scene. Now, you can go to Mr. Barrett's websites and to Veterans Today, and you can see all kinds of conspiracies that the Israelis and the Jews are behind it, which is typical Iranian fare. You can also understand that I was reading on one of those websites, for example, that the gun was found underneath the body of Mr. Well, I'm getting to that. On your website, there was a statement that the gun was found underneath Philip Marshall's body. And the fact is, we don't know that that's what occurred. He just made a statement that he was shot in the left temple when he used his right hand. Whatever he says in the interview here isn't necessarily true. And based on what I've seen from the Calaveras County Sheriff, and that's the official government body that was there, they ruled this as a killing and a suicide.
Okay.
For a man whose wife was leaving him.
All right. What about that, Mr. Barrett?
And frankly, I believe that's what was true.
All right, Mr. Barrett, how likely is that to be a case, that it's simply a case of some domestic dispute and that the man decided to kill his children and himself because of a breakup?
Well, this is pretty hilarious. I don't know where you got this guy, but this is about the lamest excuse for an attempt to debunk a conspiracy story that I've ever heard, and I've heard a lot of them. I've heard a lot of really bad ones, but this is the worst. This is quite hilarious. This guy has absolutely no grasp of any of the evidence around the Philip Marshall killing, so he starts claiming that I have a website that has information about conspiracies, and he uses this pejorative term, conspiracy theorist, to try to say that don't listen to what I say. This has nothing to do with the actual evidence of the event that we're talking about. And the reason that he's distracting you and trying to divert your attention away from this case is because that he knows he doesn't have a case. Everything he said about Philip Marshall, you could say probably about 2/3 of the men in America right now. They have the teenage daughter is mad at him once. And of course, that's preserved by our ubiquitous internet. He's having a problem with his wife. He's in a divorce case.
Well,
half of American marriages end in divorce.
Let me get back to the main point of this. I want to look at some of the things that Marshall was saying, because he was in the editing phase of his latest book, and he had said that he was somewhat worried about his safety, as because some of the allegations accuse the former administration, former U.S. President George W. Bush, of working together with Saudi intelligence to carry out the 9/11 attacks. I want to look at that aspect of what was said. Kevin Barrett, what do you think of that actual allegation that Washington and Riyadh colluded on the 9/11 attacks?
Well, Riyadh has been a puppet of what we might call the Zio-American empire, for lack of a better term. The real power structure in the world, the most powerful power structure in the world, is the Federal Reserve and the military forces it controls, including the U.S. military. And Saudi Arabia, ever since it signed an agreement with President Roosevelt in 1945, has been essentially allowing U.S. leaders, which means international banker leaders, to dictate our policy, to dictate oil prices. So it's true that whatever kind of black operations get okayed by the top of the power pyramid here in the U.S. Are going to be obeyed and participated in by the Saudis. I mean, the Saudis can't even fly their own planes, for goodness sake. The U.S. sells them warplanes, and the U.S. has to supply pilots and maintenance people to run the planes. The Saudis are a pathetic puppet state. So accusing the Saudis of involvement, sure, they were involved, but the real power behind 9/11 was the neoconservative circles here in the U.S., which is made up of people who are fanatical partisans of the Likudnik vision of Greater Israel. And Philip Marshall, he spoke out about this.
Here we go.
In part, I think the reason that he was killed was that he was a drug pilot. He worked with Barry Seal, the notorious CIA drug smuggling pilot who confessed to having smuggled drugs for the CIA, confessed to having worked with Oliver North on that operation, flying drugs through Mena, Arkansas. And having done that, having that kind of background, having participated with the CIA organized crime nexus based in New Orleans, which he wrote about in his first novel, I think it was Lakeshore, about the airport in New Orleans where the cocaine was coming in. Somebody who's that tied into black operations is not somebody that they're going to allow to run around revealing destabilizing secrets.
Okay,
so maybe they were just angry at him for his 9/11 work.
Let me get Mr. Kaplan. It seems Mr. Kaplan wants to comment. Let me get his comments on this. Mr. Kaplan, you've been shaking your head for minutes now. Go ahead. You get your chance to speak.
And I'd like not to be interrupted. Number one, this was ruled as a domestic terrorism killing, an event by the Okay, we're even. Now, let me talk. This was considered by the Calaveras County Sheriff as a domestic act of murder. It was over family disputes, over taking the children away from from Philip. And what we have here, especially with Mr. Barrett jumping in on this story, is a conspiracy theory trying to tie it again into Israel and the Jews, and, while I'm no fan of the Saudis, also Saudi relationships with America, which are in the interest of the Velati Faqih regime.
Well,
now,
let me just,
Barrett,
I'm going to jump in here, Mr. Kaplan. I want to jump in here about Saudi Arabia because you just mentioned, my question to you, because you talked about it's sort of a conspiracy. I want to look at the incident of the 9/11 attacks that, you know, the majority of, allegedly the majority of the hijackers were Saudis. However, the United States never once talked about a possible attack on Saudi Arabia, but immediately after that, we saw them going to Afghanistan and Iraq. Do you consider that significant at all, that there was never anything looked at in Saudi Arabia, and why so many of them allegedly were from Saudi Arabia?
Well, that's not true that there was nothing looked at. And after the 9/11, you see, you have to understand something about Saudi Arabia. And again, I'm no fan of the Saudis, but the Saudi royal family are 30,000 people. There are members of the royal family who are not pro-terror, and then there are significant members of the family who fund terror and who funded bin Laden. However, bin Laden was a rogue in and of himself. He did have funding from some members of the Saudi family. However, it was not an official action by the Saudi government. Now, I'm not defending the Saudis. I don't like the Saudis. What Mr. Barrett does is he runs conspiracies which always manage to tie the U.S. government, as he said before, he called it sort of a Zio cabal. In other words, or a Likud cabal. He's trying to tie Israel and the Jews to everything.
The Zio-American Empire.
He's trying to tie even, that's right, the Zio-American Empire. It's absolutely absurd. Mr. Barrett has supported and given credibility to Holocaust deniers. He has, incidentally, we talk about a domestic...
I don't want to deal with personal attacks from either one of you. I want to look at the subject at hand. And my question to you, sir, Mr. Kaplan, my question is, then we look at this from a logical perspective, why then did the United States go into Afghanistan? Because you said, for example, it was an extensive royal family of the Saudis, and there are just a few who perhaps are involved in terrorism. However, then Afghanistan, if we look at it, and we're talking about bin Laden, but you're talking about a whole country being occupied, invaded and occupied for now more than 11 years.
If you know your history, you know that the Taliban regime in Afghanistan was giving host to Osama bin Laden. And the United States asked in the beginning that he be turned over for adjudication. And the Afghan government, the Taliban, refused.
And the Taliban agreed. They just said, show us some evidence. They agreed to turn him over. They
showed them the evidence.
Any evidence against him, and we'll turn him over.
You're interrupting me. You're interrupting me. He's interrupting me again. He's interrupting me again.
You're just spewing lies.
Mr. Barrett always.
Well, stop lying, and I'll stop interrupting.
I know, and you know, Mr. Barrett. The fact is that the Taliban refused to turn over Osama bin Laden. And the fact is that the Taliban government was giving
That's not true. They offered to turn over Osama bin Laden.
That is absolutely, sir, that is absolutely true.
Okay, go ahead.
Well, buy my book, Question
turning over Osama bin Laden is an absolute bold-faced lie. That is a bold-faced lie that the Taliban were willing to turn over.
They said, we will turn over Osama bin Laden if you show us some evidence that he was involved in 9/11. And Bush refused.
Let me take a quick break. I want to switch over to some of our Facebook comments that we have viewers have put on our Facebook page. Okay, the first one. Some people from the caves far away in Afghanistan can't execute mission on that scale. And the second one, that was from Salim Said, and this one's from Saima Noor. The 24-year-old Bradley Manning exposed all data, videos of Iraq, Afghanistan, torture, and genocide. He's serving lifetime in prison. May Allah help him. From Dan Evans, still going on with the 9/11 conspiracy nonsense. After all these years, there isn't one piece of evidence to indicate that it was an inside job. In fact, all the evidence points to Al-Qaeda, and they even repeatedly admitted it, along with their many other attacks. And from Saeed Gilani, he says, to solve this math, look at the aftermath. The ones who gain are the ones who were behind this. Invading Iraq, invading Afghanistan, blank check from Congress to fight terrorists, turn Americans to hate Muslims. Homeland security was invented. Billions of dollars were stolen from Iraq. 1.5 million people killed. There are just some stuff happened after. These are just some stuff that happened after 9/11. Now you still are saying that a couple of Muslims are behind this? Well, let's take a look at some of these comments. Let's start off with Mr. Barrett. Mr. Barrett, your take on this. I mean, the majority of our viewers have basically said that, pointing to the first one, talking about caves that far away in Afghanistan, they could not have executed a mission like this. I want to look at the actual situation that happened on 9/11, because that has been the question from the very beginning, that so much of, we're talking about the United States, which has a very, very high security system in place. And we're talking about these airplanes even hitting the Pentagon, the most controlled airspace in the world, and coming from these people who were operating this out of Afghanistan in caves. Tell me your perspective on this.
Well, of course, the official story of 9/11 is ridiculous on its face. Nobody would ever have accepted it as a novel. And of course, the official 9/11 Commission report does read like a novel, because it is a novel. Philip Zelikow, who describes himself as an expert on the quote-unquote creation and maintenance of public myths, such as the myth of the surprise Japanese attack that we weren't expecting on Pearl Harbor, drafted the entire 9/11 Commission report, chapter by chapter, in outline form, before the Commission had even convened. I suspect that draft was probably the draft for the script of the operation itself. Now, it's obvious that the official story is wrong if you just look at a couple of things. One is the obvious controlled demolition of Building 7, which happened at 5:20 something in the afternoon on 9/11. It was reported 20 minutes early by the BBC. The owner of the World Trade Center, Larry Silverstein, later he admitted that he had been involved in a decision to, quote, pull it or conduct a controlled demolition of Building 7. And yet he was in a mobbed-up courtroom. He was able to get a double indemnity on his insurance money, including nearly $1 billion for Building 7 alone, the building that he admitted that he had demolished. Another aspect that's just obviously wrong about the official story is this notion that they could hit the Pentagon at 9:35 in the morning, when in fact the first planes had supposedly been noticed off course at 8:14 in the morning, almost an hour and a half earlier. So for an hour and a half, these supposedly hijacked airliners could just fly around anywhere they want to go, disappear from everybody's radar screen, suddenly reappear out of nowhere over Washington, D.C., and do an amazing stunt maneuver that kind of plane wasn't even capable of, to put a tiny little hole surrounded by intact windows in only the first floor of the Pentagon with not a scratch on the lawn. The whole story is absurd. Okay. And it doesn't take very much digging to figure that out.
I'm so sorry to interrupt you, Mr. Barrett. I mean, I would love to continue with this discussion, but we are out of time. I'd like to thank both of you for being with us, member of scientific panel for the investigation of 9/11, Mr. Kevin Barrett out of Wisconsin, and investigative journalist Mr. Lee Kaplan out of Berkeley, California. Thank you both, and thank you, viewers, for being with us. Make sure you join us right here, same time, same place tomorrow. I'm Marzieh Hashemi signing out from Tehran. Goodbye.